Wow, that was truly, truly amazing. The Metropolitan School of Arts, they were just wonderful. Let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you so much. Good morning. Welcome to our 20th Copyright Matters event. I am Karen Temple, Acting Director of the United States Copyright Office. Today we are excited to be celebrating the life cycle of copyright. What do I mean by the life cycle of copyright? Well, generally our friends at Webster define the life cycle as, quote, the series of stages through which something, such as an individual, culture, or manufactured product, passes during its lifetime. While copyright, of course, is not a living organism, it too has a life cycle and passes through many stages over time, starting from the very beginning, when it is not even a copyright yet, but simply an idea or thought that serves as that seed for a later piece of artwork that then grows into a fully formed copyrighted work, such as a book, song, photograph, or painting. Over the course of its life cycle, that copyrighted work may spread far and wide on its own as it adapts and generates other works. And finally, at the end of its copyright life cycle, when the full copyright term of protection has been achieved, the copyright work returns figuratively to the earth as it enters the public domain and is free to use and reuse by everyone. I still find it amazing and inspiring that the Founding Fathers were able to appreciate the extraordinary importance of copyright and the copyright life cycle by enshrining it in Article 1 of our Constitution, ensuring both strong copyright protection, but also recognizing the value of limited terms and the public domain. The full value and beauty of our copyright system can unfortunately sometimes be forgotten and seen as some sort of barrier to creation and innovation, when in fact it is far from that. As the Supreme Court has recognized, copyright is the engine of free expression, and the life cycle of copyright, including its exceptions, limited term, and the public domain, is all part of that critically important framework created on our Constitution. So today, we have the distinct pleasure to celebrate a part of that life cycle in a way that we have not been able to do for some time. On January 1st of this year, hundreds of works that had been under copyright protection entered into the public domain. These were works that had been created in 1923. Many have been widely recognizable for almost 100 years. Songs such as the Charleston, as you just heard, and Yes, We Have No Bananas. Films such as Harold Lloyd's Safety Last, Buster Keaton's Our Hospitality, and Charlie Chaplin's The Pilgrim. Books, stories, and essays by the likes of G.K. Chesterton, Anton Chekhov, Agatha Christie, Aldous Huxley, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Rudyard Kipling, Sinclair Lewis, and P.G. Wodehouse. These works would have entered the public domain in 1999, but then, following the lead of the European Union and to protect American authors from inequity overseas, Congress extended copyright protection in the United States by 20 years. And so this year is the first time in 2 decades that a large batch of older works has simultaneously fallen into the public domain at one time. It is important to recognize that when a work enters the public domain, of course, it does not represent the death of copyright. Rather, it is part of copyright's life cycle, the next stage of life for that creative work. The public domain is an inherent and integral part of the copyright system. So when people say that they value copyright law, the public domain is a crucial component of that. In fact, throughout our history, artistic hits have been often adaptations of classics that were in the public domain or new creations culled from public domain sources. Hollywood films Kiss Me Kate and more recently 10 Things I Hate About You are adaptations of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. The 2009 novel and movie Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is an adaptation of Jane Austen's classic novel, and Beyoncé's Ave Maria is an adaptation of Schubert's. In fact, many popular animated movies and theater productions are modern and commercially successful takes on classic public domain fairy tales. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast. This life cycle of copyright is crucial to the overall system. It provides authors the inspiration and raw material to create something new. And that is why it is valued by both authors and users. Because often, when it comes to the public domain, authors are users and users are authors of copyrighted works. And that's why today we are celebrating it here at the United States Copyright Office. With that, I would like to invite up Whitney Lewandowski, an attorney with the Office of Public Information and Education at the Copyright Office. Whitney will talk a bit more about the public domain's importance and how it functions. She'll also introduce our esteemed speakers for today. So with that, I will turn it over to Whitney. Thank you.
Thank you. As we heard from Acting Register Karen Temple, we're here to celebrate the public domain, the next stage of life for a creative work. The Constitution allowed Congress to grant copyright, but it also set forth that the protection was for a limited time. This limited nature is important to the creative life of the United States. Today, you will learn about the many angles of the public domain. How does it work for creative people? How can it work for each of us? And where can we find it? We'll learn about how public domain works provide an ongoing and renewable legacy of creativity. We'll hear from a documentarian and a musical historian about how the public domain assists and shapes their work. We will also explore this rich background and highlight some works and authors of those works that are entering the public domain this year. So the public domain, it's not a place. We can't find it on a map. When we say public domain, we mean simply that the work is not protected by copyright and it's free for anyone to use. The public domain is a wellspring of knowledge and creativity that allows individuals and institutions to supply new creativity and thought. Vampires. Pride and Prejudice. The works of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. These are just a few brief examples about how we've used the public domain to inspire new creative works. The public domain gives us the ability to stretch our imaginations, to take common touchstones to new places, and reevaluate long-standing works in contemporary times. While we are highlighting today the end of copyright term as one way of growing the public domain, Karen mentioned that the public domain is far more than works whose copyright term has ended. There are a number of other ways that works are in the public domain from their inception. All works, for example, created by federal employees in the scope of their employment are in the public domain. A small sampling of works created by employees in the public trust include the fruits of the Works Progress Administration, the first photograph of Earth by astronaut Bill Anders, titled Earthrise, photographs from field work by government agencies, medical imagery, there we go, and of course, studies and reports produced by the government, including the Copyright Office. And oftentimes, we use the public domain to extend beyond creative works. We use public domain to refer to the building blocks of knowledge and creativity. Things like facts, processes, and systems, basic shapes, social dances, short words and phrases. All in all, the public domain is the wealth of resources that are available to everyone. Now, there may be no more immediate example of inspirational public domain works than those penned by Shakespeare. The Folger Shakespeare Library, which is just across the street from us, it has the largest collection of materials relating to Shakespeare and his works, which includes centuries of adaptations on the stage, in music, in art, and for film. We will be using the long history of Shakespearean inspiration as the focal point to examine the important role of public domain works in adaptation. Our first presenter is Douglas Lanier. He is the professor of English at University of New Hampshire and a long-term research fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library. He did his graduate work at Duke University, and he specialized in medieval and early modern drama. He has taught at Duke, UCLA, Allegheny College, Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, the University of Milan, and Universidad de Murcia in Spain. His pioneering work in the study of modern adaptations of Shakespeare in mass media will provide the foundation for his insight into the cultural recirculation of public domain works, the cultural afterlife, and the elevation of works through adaptations over time. His book, Shakespeare and Modern Popular Culture, established the basic parameters of one of the 5 most liveliest fields of Shakespeare studies today. He is currently at work on 2 book projects. First, a history of screen adaptation of Othello worldwide, and second, a study of reparative Shakespeare, which are productions of Shakespeare addressed to the traumas of socially marginalized groups. So please welcome me in welcoming Douglas.
Hello, can you hear me? The original public domain materials in Western culture are what we've come to call the classics of Greek and Latin antiquity. They did not begin their lives as classics. These works were freely available for creative use, what rhetoricians call imitatio, by all who could master the written languages. It was through their recirculation in adapted form that they attained the status of a classic. The word classic then specifies not some monumental steady state, but the result of an ongoing, dynamic, always historically contingent process, an important condition of which is the work's availability in the public realm. And this process of classicizing involves a paradox. The cultural afterlife of a work depends upon its being creatively altered, repurposed, appropriated, made into something other than its former self. A work is effectively dead unless it has new readers and audiences, new performers and adapters who allow it to speak to a new present. I'm going to dodge for the moment some very tricky questions of politics and ethics in this process of appropriation. There's nothing to guarantee that adaptations will be faithful to their sources, and nothing to guarantee that adaptations will serve socially responsible purposes. Here I want simply to observe that a condition for art having a robust afterlife is that it is available for creative adaptation. Now, in the Anglophone literary tradition, several artists have achieved the status of classics. Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, and Charles Dickens come immediately to mind. But none has had a history of adaptation as long, as varied, and global in scope as Shakespeare. He is the Coca-Cola of literature. And though the reasons for his extraordinary cultural afterlife are many, one key is that Shakespeare's work has long been in the public domain and therefore an irresistible object for adaptation. Now, it's possible to think about Shakespearean adaptation from several angles. One has to do with medium. Shakespeare's dramatic writing needs to be converted from its initial form as a script into a living performance for any of his works to become a play. Interestingly, Shakespeare's early cultural afterlife involved his being presented in the public realm in 2 forms at once: as a stage performance, developing in a number of directions over the 18th and 19th century, and as a printed book, first appearing as the first folio in 1623, the printed collection that redefined Shakespeare as an object for readers rather than theater audiences. Now, this 2-track mode of adaptation, stage and print, the two predominant literary modes of the period, may have much to do with Shakespeare's status as a classic. As new media emerged in cultural importance, so too did Shakespeare become accommodated to them. The 19th century, for example, was particularly keen to adapt Shakespeare to the newly ascendant form of opera and instrumental music. In the 20th century, here we go, Shakespeare's writings have been adapted to all modes of new media: advertising, motion pictures, radio, audio performance, television, digital text, even social media. Indeed, a central function of Shakespearean adaptation has been to make new media formats seem less intimidating and alien, to demonstrate their utility or lend them cultural authority. This is particularly true at moments where a new medium might seem to threaten the cultural status quo. Such was the case with silent Shakespeare films in the early 20th century or radio Shakespeare in the US in the mid-1930s. In a process we call reciprocal legitimation, Shakespeare serves to legitimize the new medium, while at the same time the new medium serves to legitimize Shakespeare's status as a classic and reconfirm his place in the public realm for a new generation. Now, I should stress that that each new media manifestation of Shakespeare always involves reconceiving what Shakespeare can be. It's never just a matter of reformatting. Film Shakespeare is very different from stage Shakespeare, print Shakespeare, televisual Shakespeare, radio Shakespeare. Each of these media highlight certain elements of Shakespeare's art and makes new perceptions of his achievement possible. We come to Shakespeare on film with different expectations of realism than we do with print Shakespeare or stage Shakespeare. The actor's work and technique is different in film Shakespeare than it is in audio or stage productions. And how we experience our Shakespeare in the theater, in the home, on a large or small screen, in a live or recorded format, affects how we understand the nature and significance of Shakespeare's art. And new media can get us to think anew about Shakespeare's own artistry. In the opening speech of Henry V, for example, the chorus expresses his dissatisfaction with the stage apparatus of the Globe Theater. The wooden O, with small casts and an unworthy scaffold, all that is inadequate to the epic greatness of Henry's campaign in the vasty fields of France. Is Shakespeare here imagining the as yet unborn medium of modern film, with its capacity to show in widescreen splendor what Shakespeare can only ask his audience to imagine in the mind's eye? In other words, does filming Shakespeare's plays allow us to see qualities that were there all along? Now, Shakespeare's cultural afterlife has also depended on our ability to change the content of his work to suit the tenor and tastes of the time and the purposes of adapters. Practically no stage production of Shakespeare performs the text as written. 18th and 19th century dramatists routinely produced their own versions of the plays, smoothing out the meter, adding new characters and subplots, ruthlessly cutting what they thought was obscure or bawdy, even crafting happy endings for the tragedies, as Nahum Tate famously did for his 1681 King Lear, the text of which ruled the stage for the next 150 years. Adapters have filled in the gaps in the lives of Shakespeare's characters and of Shakespeare himself with fully fleshed out fictional biographies, prequels and sequels, some even inserting the author into the mix. The film Shakespeare in Love, for example, continues the long tradition of imagining what we can't get from the historical record, the process by which Shakespeare conceived and wrote Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare's scripts are now routinely recontextualized in all manners of settings, from The Tempest in Outer Space, to Macbeth in a mental hospital, to Midsummer Night's Dream in modern Hollywood, to Othello in a Southern prep school. And film and television have long dressed up Shakespeare's work in modern dress and language, so that we're often watching Shakespeare without knowing we're doing so. My students are often surprised when I tell them that 10 Things I Hate About You is an adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew, or the zombie romance Warm Bodies is a version of Romeo and Juliet. Indeed, the increasingly oral and visual nature of 21st century Shakespeare, that is to say, its non-literary bent, as well as the globalization of Shakespeare, which is to say, Shakespeare in translation, means that our Shakespeare is much less centered on the specificities of Shakespeare's language. The wildly popular interactive performance piece, Sleep No More, by the British performance troupe Punchdrunk, uses Shakespeare's Macbeth as its inspiration, but not a word of Shakespeare's script is ever uttered as the audience wanders through the company's meticulously constructed environment and watches the silent actors. Lastly, Shakespeare's availability in the public realm becomes a vehicle for cultural dialogue, a shared terrain on which ideas can do battle or speak across cultural divides. With Shakespeare, adapters speak to the present through a well-established common set of stories, and they can also talk back to the past or protest injustice by co-opting Shakespeare's inherited cultural authority. The Tempest has long been recognized as a founding text in the discourse of Western colonialism, a work that asserts the need to subjugate unruly native peoples. But through adaptation, The Tempest has become a powerful means to contest colonial discourse, to assert a perspective untold in Shakespeare's original play. In Aimé Césaire's adaptation Une Tempête, the rebellious Caliban, proud of his African heritage, eventually abandons the old, helpless Prospero, gaining in the process victory over his colonial tormentor. In Shylock Is My Name, one of the recent Hogarth Shakespeare series, a set of prose retellings of Shakespeare's plays, Howard Jacobson depicts an irascible Shylock who magically reappears in contemporary Manchester to a modern lapsed Jew named Strulovich, who is himself a victim of anti-Semitism. In the novel, Shylock uses the situation to answer Shakespeare's anti-Semitic portrayal of him in The Merchant of Venice. He engineers a way to replay the famous trial scene on his own comic terms, so that both he and Strulovich are redeemed. The contemporary Indian filmmaker Vishal Bhardwaj has made a trio of films that reimagine Indian culture. I'm thinking of the films Makbul, Omkara, and Haider. He uses his Shakespeare to comment on live issues in Indian society, matters like organized crime and civic corruption, the persistence of the caste system, honor killing, and terrorism. The work of Bhardwaj and other contemporary non-Anglophone adapters suggests that Shakespeare is becoming a global lingua franca, a set of plots, characters, motifs, and themes sufficiently familiar worldwide to open up new possibilities of cross-cultural storytelling. Let me end on 2 points. First, the relationship between cultural afterlives and adaptation that I'm discussing is not unique to Shakespeare. He illustrates well the paradox of art in the public realm, that an artwork's robust cultural afterlife depends upon its being taken up and manipulated by later generations, not all of whom will be faithful to the original or respectful of its intentions. Cultural afterlives depend upon creative infidelity. My second point is that if one takes the long historical view, adaptation has long been the cultural norm in creative communities. The notion that authors can exercise control of, after their works have entered the public arena is a relatively new and culturally specific notion. Modern copyright dates from 1709. And perhaps it's a historical aberration, challenged by the creative impulse to sample and new technology that makes that especially easy to do. How to sustain current concepts of copyright in the face of contemporary adaptational practice seems to me a question worth asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. So we know that the works of Shakespeare were never protected under US copyright law. But what of all these adaptations? If they were protected under copyright, how long does protection last? Duration of copyright looks a lot different today than it did in 1923. For works created today, the general rule is that duration of copyright is life of the author plus 70 years. The works that expired on January 1st, 2019 were protected under an original term of 26 years and a renewal term. The original term was secured by publication with notice or registration with the U.S. Copyright Office. The renewal term was secured only by registration with the Copyright Office. This renewal term, it was originally 26 years, but through a series of acts by Congress, the last one being the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, eventually the renewal term was extended to 69 years. This Congress's ability to pass these extensions was affirmed by the Supreme Court in Eldred versus Ashcroft. As a result, these works, first published or registered in 1923, secured a copyright term of 95 years. This term structure, an original term and a renewal term, governs all works that first secured protection prior to January 1st, 1978. There are many technical rules with duration that I won't belabor today, but know this: we will see a new crop of works enter the public domain each year. For example, works from 1924 will enter the public domain in 2020, 1925, 2021, and so on. The use of public domain images and footage helps us to build our sense of history. They provide context to first-person narratives, and artists can recast public domain works to deepen our connections to the past. For example, Peter Jackson's recent documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old, modified original footage from World War I with colorization, modern production techniques, sound effects, and voice acting. In this clip, courtesy of the Imperial War Museum, Jackson provides insight into the thought process behind their interpretation of public domain footage.
Hi, I'm Peter Jackson, and I'm delighted to present They Shall Not Grow Old as part of the Imperial War Museum's Short Film Festival 2018. At the beginning, we were feeling our way through what's this going to be, and by the time we were finished, it really felt like the natural thing to do. Let them tell their story, and they're not telling the story of, why the Somme happened or why Passchendaele, was such a disaster. They're not telling that story. They're just telling us what it was like to be a soldier. And with that being the soundtrack, just purely their voices, it then became apparent that we should try to present the images with as close as we could to what they experienced. And they didn't see the war in black and white, for instance, you know, they saw the war in colour. But we didn't want to do reconstructions. We could easily dress up a lot of guys in uniforms and film some stuff today, but we didn't want to do that. We wanted to use strictly archive footage. Somehow the net result on that is making these people into human beings.
Beyond that, you written Dr. Trellick.
You didn't care how the war was going.
So, to provide a first-hand account of how documentarians take existing works as raw material to create something new, we are pleased to have Nina Gilden-Seavey as a presenter today. Seavey is an Emmy Award-winning documentarian with a 30-year history in the nonfiction world. Her films can be seen in theaters, on television, in ancillary media, and in museums across the globe. Seavey is a research professor of history and media and public affairs at George Washington University and is the director of the Documentary Center in the School of Media and Public Affairs. She will share with us the balance documentarians strike when contending with images and clips that may or may not be publicly available. She will also provide insight into the industry around public domain materials and its bearing on creating historical documentaries. So, please join me in welcoming Nina to the stage.
Thank you. Well, I'm not as famous as Peter Jackson, but he and I share the same problems of how do you create something out of the past. Now, in his World War I film, he used public domain images as archival material. I mean, it was literally artifact of a certain era about which he was making a very literal film. Most documentary filmmakers are not doing that. We're taking images that we need to represent a story that we are shaping into an entirely different narrative. So we're not using these images as artifact, but we're using them as representation. So because I am a professor, I'm going to give you a little assignment. I am going to show you a clip from a film that I made, a trailer from my film, A Paralyzing Fear, the Story of Polio in America. And this film posed a number of interesting challenges about the public domain. Because, of course, filmmakers are omnivorous. We need not one series of images, we need thousands of images. While I was sitting here, I was actually thinking, what would be the average number of images in a 90-minute film, which is what A Paralyzing Fear was. So I thought, well, an image on the screen changes about once every 5 seconds, right? So theoretically, you could have somewhere between 900 and 1,000 images that need to be somehow collected in any given film, and you need to either own the right to that material, or it has to be in the public domain, which means it's free and you can use it at will. Well, the problem for documentary filmmakers is that we are not just an omnivorous group, but we're an impoverished group. And so this issue of what do we use and how do we use it becomes kind of an interesting, I wouldn't say it's a game that we play, but it is a little bit of one. And there has become, because of the kind of voracious appetite that documentary filmmakers have, we have become a bit of an industry for the both materials that are in copyright and that which is entered into the public domain. Now, the good news for documentary filmmakers is that we don't have to wait very long because unlike Shakespeare, where we had to wait for many, many years for that to enter the public domain, in documentary, much of what has come into the public domain were works created by the federal government themselves, which is interesting because the federal government is indeed a very large producer of filmed work. So there is an unending repository that I send my students out into College Park, Maryland, and they have to go look, like on a treasure hunt, for some of these images. because they are fertile territory for great stories and the kinds of material that we love to use in films because A, there's a lot of it, and B, it's free. So, hence my assignment to you, which is to take a look at this clip, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the problems and the opportunities of public domain as related to this particular film. There's a little 5-minute clip. I kind of pulled a little bit of a fast one on our AV people, so the people who are live streaming this may not be able to get it because I'm going to show another film a little bit later along that is definitely not in the public domain. But this one is the trailer for A Paralyzing Fear, the story of polio in America, which is also on YouTube. So follow me along and take a look at this clip, and then we're going to talk about the conundrum of public domain in documentary.
Well, every summer, come June, fear would begin creeping through the communities of America.
It was a terrifying
At
time.
that point, everyone was afraid of it.
Stores were empty.
Don't go swimming.
Restaurants were empty.
We didn't take our children into large
Don't go into
crowds.
big crowds.
People stayed home because of the fear of
It was just a very desperate time.
I fell out of my bed. When I went to put my legs over the side of the bed, I couldn't get up. I just fell.
I suddenly got very dizzy and disoriented and actually bumped right into a parking sign.
I remember being scared and asking, what is the matter with me? What's the matter with me? Suddenly, it seemed like we were really alone. The thing that was frightening was just watching all of these rows upon rows of children laying in wards.
I had Roosevelt as a role model, and he could do anything, and so could I. He was handsome, he was attractive to women. He was popular with the public, and then he got polio. And polio was the only thing that he had ever confronted that he couldn't beat.
And I like a diamond change, too.
Are you saving them, Mickey?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to give mine to President Roosevelt.
The president? Why, Mickey?
Yes, you see, Judy, I've got my envelope made out right here. It's all ready to go. See for yourself.
Oh, I know. That's a March of Dimes, the Infantile Paralysis Fund.
That's right. Think of it. You can lick infantile paralysis with the March of Dimes.
Jonas Salk was always an intense person. He was a man possessed once he could see the prize out there and could see that, yes, we're going to be able to conquer polio.
He was excited and stimulated that finally there was going to be a trial in human beings.
From overcast Ann Arbor, Michigan this morning, humanity received some of the brightest news in all its history. The killer, the crippler, poliomyelitis, is losing the war.
For me, it was too little too late. But I was so grateful. I was so grateful that no one else would have to go through this.
Okay, thank you. So, here was the problem. When I decided to make this film, I went to the March of Dimes, and I said, I want to make a film about polio. And they said, well, you and everybody else who's ever come to us, and the answer is no. Because they owned all of the rights to all of the material. So, not being one to ever take no for an answer, I begged and I pleaded and I collected all of the best science, historians of science and medicine and many famous people who had had polio, and they lobbied on my behalf. And finally, the March of Dimes said, okay, we're going to let you be the first filmmaker that we have ever given our archive to. There is a warehouse in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and we don't know how many films are there and how many photographs, but we're going to give you the key. So I got my trusty crew together and got an 18-wheeler truck, and we went up to Fort Lee, New Jersey, and sure enough, we pulled out 3,000 films and 5,000 photographs. It's an interesting amount of material. So I started looking at this stuff, and I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. The federal government was involved in the fight against polio. So a lot of this is their footage. And as we find out in this piece, and as you probably know already, the person who really led the fight against polio was FDR as president. And so a lot of that material was also taken during the time that he was president of the United States. And it was in the FDR library at Warm Springs. And so honestly, I started to question a little bit the March of Dimes claim on this material. Now, we came to what we call a blanket license. I paid them a heap of money, they give me a heap of film and photographs, everybody goes home happy. But in the question of what was in the public domain, it really became kind of a bit of a head scratcher for me. Because I thought, wait a minute, they are claiming copyright to something that I know for a fact they don't own. But I decided we're going to leave that to the side for the moment. Because some of the material, I mean, they were a private foundation with monies raised through private funds. And so a lot of it was theirs, but it was all mixed together. And hence the problem for the documentarian is that we live in the era of motion picture and have since the beginning of the 20th century. And where this material comes from and how do you trace it back becomes a bit of a puzzle. Well, that puzzle becomes, I think, ever more interesting because somewhere along the line, you know, especially after kind of the cable industry entered sort of the documentary filmmaking world with the History Channel and Discovery Channel and all National Geographic Channel and all of these other channels, and the need for documentary films just exploded, so did the need for material around which these films would be made. So many enterprising young entrepreneurs came to Washington, to the Library of Congress, where we are today, and to the National Archives, where we are down the street, and they copied everything, which is interesting, right? Because what they did is they took everything that was in the public domain, and you have all of these filmmakers from all around the world who is omnivorous and finance-starved as I am, and they sell the material that is in the public domain. They don't call it a rights fee. They call it, an acquisition fee or an administrative fee. But in fact, what you're doing is you're paying for the rights to public domain material because you're sitting out in Omaha, Nebraska, and Nebraska Public Television wants you to make a nice documentary about, an issue for which there is plenty of public domain material. It's going to cost a lot of money to send you to the National Archives, plus you probably don't have the time that it takes, which is 6 weeks, to get the material reproduced. So there is an industry that has actually developed around public domain material because we are, as I said, a voracious consumer of material. So, but there is still a lot of question. Now, just in that little clip alone, there are, over 100 images, right? From the past, and I can promise you that the March of Dimes nor any other rights holder knows who owns what to whom. We do know that probably the Walt Disney material, we know who owns that, right? But aside from that, I can promise you nobody else is quite clear on that subject. So it's an interesting problem of how do you tether out. And documentary filmmakers, and I'm not going to bore you with the legalities of this, lawyers kind of owning our lives. All documentary filmmakers carry errors and omissions insurance. And that guarantees to a broadcaster that when we bring something to them, that they're not going to be liable for violation of copyright, but rather we take the responsibility, we take the liability for any error that we may have incurred so that nobody is held responsible at the network level, but the documentary filmmaker is going to take all the responsibility on him or herself, which is quite a burden. But the fact is that trying to parse out where does this stuff come from, who owns it, and when it is in the public domain, why am I really paying for it? Because it has become a very large and profitable industry for many companies, and I salute them for their enterprise that have managed to take kind of the cableization of American life and turned it into quite a profitable business for them. The last little bit I'm going to talk about is the confusion amongst documentary filmmakers and the public at large about what is in public domain and what is fair use. Fair use, and my students do this all the time. Oh, I can use that, it's fair use, it's on YouTube. Ruh-roh. There is a common belief that if it's out there and I can get it, it's mine. And fair use, and I'm not going to go into the complications of it, is actually a fairly limited classification under which a documentary filmmaker or someone else can take a piece of material that is indeed copyrighted and used for their own purposes. One of those, the central premises of fair use is that the rights holder, if you're creating a polemic of something, and they would have every reason not to grant you copyright in your in this issue of the polemic, and it's kind of part of in the public discourse, then that is a pretty legitimate fair use claim. I'm going to show you a clip from my most recent work. And this cannot be streamed because the question of fair use has yet to be fought on this one. But it does pose sort of an interesting challenge to who owns what and how much documentary filmmakers sort of claim for themselves. Anyway, this is a clip from my new project called My Fugitive, and it will not be streamed. what I found, and I'm not going to tell you everything, the project will drop on May 4th, 2020, which is the 50th anniversary of the Kent State murders, was the connection between what happened to Howard Buchanan and his other co-defendants and the investigation into the conspiracy to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King. So the question as to what is going to enter into fair use on this particular project is going to be kind of a long and protracted one. I have great legal representation. So, but it is an interesting kind of conundrum for documentary filmmakers between what is in the public domain and what is available to us for fair use, which is an altogether other and interesting dialogue. On that note, I'd like to conclude, and I thank you for your time and appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Nina. So one of the things that Nina touched on was the essential and sometimes difficult issue of access. That idea of sending students out to College Park to do the treasure hunt for government works. Access to public domain works is as important to the public domain as the public domain itself. You can find and use public domain works at a number of cultural institutions, from your local library to a national museum. Here at the Copyright Office, we have much of our records available to the public, our production as government workers, and we are expanding the number and type of records that we can make public available online. The Library of Congress has many of its collections scanned and available for use. And the films that we're sharing today come from the Packard campus at the Library of Congress, and the Packard campus has a screening room and theater in Culpeper, Virginia. In addition, there are many private and nonprofit online resources for public domain works, including Project Gutenberg, HathiTrust, Amazon Kindle, and Google. So, on to musicals, a quintessentially American art form. From the late 19th century to today, musicals have evolved in form, narrative, and production. This year, musical works from multiple productions enter the public domain, including The Rise of Rosie O'Reilly by George M. Cohan, A Perfect Lady by George Gershwin, Music Box Review by Irving Berlin, and The Wildflower by Oscar Hammerstein. Our next presenter is Benjamin West, a director, producer, performer, writer, and musical theater historian. His current projects include the Showtime Trilogy, direct from Proctor's 23rd Street Theater for One Night Only, January 16, 1920, and 514 Broadway. West's directing credits include Unsung Caroline Lee for Lincoln Center's American Songbook, Gatsby, The Songs in Concert, Make Mine Manhattan, and The Fig Leaves Are Falling. His Broadway credits include assistant director and dramaturge for Old Acquaintance, assistant producer for August Osage County and The Homecoming, and production assistant for Talk Radio. He is the founder of Unsung Musical Company and a 2017 recipient of Lincoln Center's Martin E. Siegel Award. He will share with us a case study in the use of public domain works from his documentary musical series, The Showtime Trilogy. The second installment of this trilogy, entitled 45 Minutes from Coontown, a celebration of Black musical theater, tracing its history from the late 1800s through 1999, will open on September 12, 2019 at the York Theater Company in New York City. So, without further ado, Benjamin West.
Good morning. Thank you, Whitney. I am Ben West, and I am a musical theater artist and historian. My focus and my passion is really twofold. One, illuminating the intersection of past, present, and future, effectively how successive generations of artists and audiences continue to influence and inform one another. And two, exploring how the American musical is a reflection of American consciousness. So effectively, it's capturing our social, cultural, and political sensibilities at any moment in time throughout its history. There are two quotes that speak to both of these themes that I happen to love. One is by lyricist and composer Harold Rome, who was a tremendous Broadway revue writer and also wrote a number of book musicals. Destry Rides Again and Fanny are two of his shows. And he says, whether you want to be original or whether you want to be conventional, you still have to know what has been done in order to be either. This is a quote that I particularly love. And the other one is from Yip Harburg, who you'll know as the lyricist of The Wizard of Oz, of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, and a number of Broadway musicals. And he says, a songwriter is really a journalist of time with music. So both of these quotes certainly feed me and I think feed my focus. And with these two focuses, I'm looking a lot at writers, creators, craftsmen of the form, and my projects tend to deal with the history of the American musical in some way, shape, or form. And in dealing with the history of the American musical, I am working a lot with public domain materials. And in fact, all 5 of these songs that you see up here are currently in public domain, and all 5 of these songs are also incorporated into my current project, which is the Showtime Trilogy. And with that, I'll give you a brief background on the trilogy, and then we're going to look at 2 specific sequences so we can have a sense of how public domain works are used in the creation of this new work. The Showtime Trilogy is a project I began developing about 5 years ago now, almost 5 years ago, and research for the piece has taken me to more than 20 different archives across the country, including here in DC, the Library of Congress, of course, the Copyright Office, and actually also Howard University, I should mention. The trilogy is 3 documentary musicals which celebrate and chart the history of the American musical. Now, the project aims to be comprehensive in its coverage. So we go back to minstrelsy and vaudeville in the 1800s. We move through the turn-of-the-century musical burlesque and American operetta, George M. Cohan, and so forth, all the way to the works of George C. Wolfe and Jason Robert Brown in the 1990s. And the cutoff point for the project is 1999. In terms of the documentary musical construct, it is a form that I've been developing over the past several years, and I do believe it's unique in its form. We are essentially weaving live music and live performance through this nonfiction historical narrative to tell the story of the American musical. Now, each piece is designed as a solo show, and the narrator is very much an omniscient vessel through whom the history flows forth and in whom the various styles of music and performance are embodied. Each piece, I should also mention, is fully scripted. So it is a fully scripted musical. Again, it's nonfiction, so we're not talking about a historical or biographical dramatization, but it's actually documentary in nature. And as such, we're utilizing narration, quotes, newspaper articles, and existing songs to tell this story of a uniquely American art form. And it's very much, I should point out, an active story. It's a very active theatrical story. And in terms of the songs, the trilogy, all told, uses more than 100 songs in the telling of this story, 100 existing songs. And that's more than 100 songs over all 3 installments. So I'll break down quickly the installments for you. The first installment and primary entry is Showtime, the first 100 years of the American musical. And this really looks at the evolution of the form itself and its cultural impact. And just a quick example of what I mean by the evolution of the form. New York Times article, 1907, it reads in part, talking about the form, about the musical, this American musical. New York Times, 1907, fashions in plays may change, but musical comedy remains about the same from beginning to end. It is taken as a matter of course that the tunes will be reminiscent, the characters are nearly always the same, and the comedy in many of these shows is their saddest feature. There are, as a rule, only two classes of musical comedy, the good and the bad. And then we jump forward 40 years, and Alan J. Lerner, who you'll know as the author of My Fair Lady and Brigadoon, speaking about the American musical, again 1947, and he says, "The musical theater in America is becoming a vital medium of dramatic expression, with words, music, and movement blended together in complete synchronization, a real art form is revealed." So Showtime is essentially looking at this evolution from minstrelsy, vaudeville, early musical comedy into the real art form being revealed and through to the 90s. I'll also point out this first installment premiered this past September at the theater at St. Peter's, and the second installment, 45 Minutes from Coontown, will premiere this coming September at the same venue. 45 Minutes from Coontown is specifically about black musicals and black writers in particular. And the third and final installment is 68 Ways to Go, which is about female musical theater writers, and that will premiere in 2020. And then the plan is to premiere the trilogy in its entirety in 2021, where we will have each show in succession. Now that's the trilogy, and we'll take a look at two sequences from the primary entry, Showtime, the First 100 Years, to give a sense of how public domain material has been used in creating the narrative and creating the piece. Showtime, the First 100 Years, the primary entry, utilizes 59 existing songs in total. 21 of those are public domain, and 38 are still under copyright. The show is 2 acts, and including the intermission, it runs about 2:20, 2:25. We'll look at 2 specific songs that are in Showtime, the First 100 Years. They are Jazz Baby and Prohibition Blues. Completely coincidentally, both are from 1919, and both are co-authored by a female writer. Jazz Baby has lyrics by Blanche Merrill, and Prohibition Blues has music by Nora Bayes. Now, when we encounter these songs in Showtime, it's in a scene that deals with the early 20th century. We begin the scene talking about the various musical styles that are spreading across the stage at that time, and then we get to ragtime and its evolution into jazz. And you'll see we come to Jazz Baby here. So just a brief point about part of the language of the show. The lyric in almost all of the songs was specifically chosen to filter into the narrative, to become part of the narrative. So we mention ragtime evolving, but we don't actually mention jazz. And so the question of into what does it evolve is answered through the song. So music comes in, and we have the first chorus of Jazz Baby. And then you'll see music under at the bottom of that. Again, another part of the language of storytelling in this particular show. Music is woven through the narrative, through much of the show. So you'll see music will continue under for an Irving Berlin quote. And again, speaking further to the language of the show, you'll see a parenthetical that says downbeats only, then we have one line of dialogue, and then we have music full for the quote. Music and also acoustic sound effects that are made by the drummer and his various toys are used throughout the show, throughout the entire piece, as really connective tissue and also as oral quotation marks. So when you see, we're going to show a video clip of this, you'll see that there's going to be just downbeats only for 2 bars where we set up the quote, and then music will come in fully under the quote itself. So it's to help differentiate and delineate between what is narration and what is the actual quote. Following the Irving Berlin quote, we go into another bit of Jazz Baby, and then you'll see music under, at the bottom of the screen here, stop time. So we're going to go music under again, this time for a Rosamond Johnson quote. He was an early black composer. And this is going to be speaking about Negro spirituals and the roots of this form, and essentially hearkening back to slavery. And in so doing, the feel of the underscore is entirely different than the feel of the more celebratory Irving Berlin quote. We're going to be in stop time, which you'll see in a moment, and also you'll notice that it's going to go minor in what we're talking about. And music will cut out after that. So I'll stop there, and then we're going to take a look at the video right now. I want to mention just 3 quick points. My music collaborator for the entire trilogy, all 3 installments, is Fran Minaric, who has created all new arrangements for all of the songs and helped me to weave them through the narrative, quite literally. Our director and musical stager for Showtime, The First 100 Years, is Shannon Lewis. And then at the beginning of the clip, there is a drum roll. That's not actually part of the script. That is just setting up the clip. So disregard the drum roll. All right, so let's take a look at this Jazz Baby sequence.
I'm jazz, baby. I wanna be jazzing all the time. There's something in the tone of the saxophone that makes me do a little something so I am. 'Cause I'm a jazz baby, full of jazz but harmony. That what the dog and ball, the jack that calls all the talk are just a copy of the way I naturally walk. 'Cause I'm a jazz baby, a little jazz baby, that's me. From the desk of Irving Berlin. When I say that jazz is the only great contribution of the 20th century to the artistic annals of the world, I am speaking with the utmost seriousness. The outstanding characteristics of America's millions are found in this music. Its tremendous popularity is due to the fact that it sounds a note to which Americans are responsive. It is the music of a melting pot. Jazz, 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 that's all I am. One day long, I never could get through. Jazz, 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 that's all I want to do. Play me a little jazz. Negro spirituals were born of suffering souls crying out for deliverance. Black composer Rosamond Johnson explained. Words and melody were mingled together and handed down. Even in this present era, when Negro songs have taken flight on the musical wings of sophistication into modern melodies and exotic harmonizations, one can still feel the influence of Negro idioms.
So, thank you. So that is a bit of the Jazz Baby sequence. In fact, it continues right on. There's no break. From the Rosamond Johnson quote, we go into a socio-political section, a small socio-political section, because, again, one of the themes being the American musical as a reflection of our social consciousness. So again, from Rosamond Johnson, we go directly into a section about Black writers. And so I actually have a question for everyone here. I wonder if anyone can name any Black musical theater writers working early 20th century, 1900 to 1930. Anybody, any guesses? Any guesses? Yes. Yes, Colin Johnson, for sure. Yes, awesome, great. So there were actually quite a few Black writers working on Broadway in the early 20th century, relatively speaking. Certainly the form was still dominated by white men, but there were a tremendous number of Black artists. I'll point out Bob Cole, who you mentioned, who I consider the father of Black musical theater. He devised what is considered the first full-length, legitimate Black musical comedy, A Trip to Coontown. This was in 1897, and that is the Coontown that we reference in our 45 Minutes from Coontown title. And I'll also mention at the top there James P. Johnson, and then toward the middle Cecil Mack, because they wrote The Charleston, which you heard earlier. And that was from 1923, which you pointed out, from a Black musical called Runnin' Wild. And then from the Black author section, we jump right into female writers. And so again, I wonder, can anyone name any female musical theater writers working early 20th century, 1900 to 1930. Any guesses? Okay. There were also quite a number of women working. Dorothy Fields, I think if you don't know the name, you probably know her work. I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Baby, On the Sunny Side of the Street, a number of pop standards. I want to also call attention to Alma Sanders, who is at the bottom right of the screen, because a bit of her story speaks to how essentially the social dynamics are informing the American musical. She eventually moved to New York, but was actually living in Detroit when she began her career. She would eventually marry her lyricist, her lyric writing partner. He would be her second husband. She was married to her first husband at the time, though, in Detroit, who wanted to get a divorce from her. As she was on the cusp of breaking through in the musical theater. She would go on to write a handful of shows in the 20s, and in 1921 is when the divorce happened. So I'll read, this is from the Detroit Free Press, March 1921. Ernest E. Benjamin was granted a divorce from his wife, the well-known songwriter Alma Sanders. Benjamin testified that his wife's success in writing 2 song hits turned her head, and she refused to keep house any longer or to live in Detroit. He said she spent much of her time in New York, coming and going as she pleased. So that's just a fun little bit. I'm in the midst of writing the women's show right now. We start readings next week. So I enjoy her story. And so then, from female writers, we cap this jazz and socio-political sequence with Prohibition blues. And we get there again, we're early 20th century. So that's women's right to vote being ratified in 1920, also income tax and prohibition. So again, Prohibition blues brings us back to the jazz vernacular. We'll play the Prohibition blues clip now, and then I'll pop up the script page for it immediately after. So this is Prohibition blues.
I've had news that's bad news about my best pal. His name is Old Man Alcohol, but I call him Al. The doctor said he's tired, as sure can be. And if that's so, then oh, the difference to me, there won't be no sunshine, no stars, no moon, no laughter, no music, except this one sad tune. Goodbye forever to my old pal Booze. Doggone, I've got the Prohibition blues.
And I just want to mention again, the music is by Nora Bayes, who is one of the first female musical theater composers, who I happen to love. She was a very big vaudeville and stage star. And so here's just a quick look at the script page for Prohibition Blues. Again, you'll see we cap the idea of social consciousness at the top. We go into Prohibition Blues. Again, part of the language the music will continue under for a final quote about jazz to wrap up and come full circle with this jazz sequence, and then we move forward. Just in terms of using the songs in the narrative and in telling the story, these 2 songs were used almost in their entirety, but that's not the case with all of the songs. In some cases, we use just 2 or 3 lines. In some cases, we just use a chorus. So it really depends on the needs of the specific moment and how the song is utilized in the storytelling. And With that, I think I have completed. So that is how essentially the songs are used in the show. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ben. Before we go, there is a fourth speaker that we were hoping to have here today. I want to take a moment to highlight a powerful example of how the use of public domain works can help us better understand ourselves and our current time. Nina's presentation highlighted for us the way documentarians use the public domain to bring truth and understanding to often difficult and painful experiences. We were hoping to have Taina Carrigal, curator at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, join us today to discuss the works included in the recent exhibition, Unseen, Our Past in a New Light, to highlight a similar practice among visual artists. Unfortunately, because of the government shutdown, she is unable to participate in the event today. Carrigal co-curated with Asma Naim the works of Ken Gonzalez-Day and Titus Kaphar to produce an exhibition that considers the intersections between portraiture, nation building, and museum practice. A brief warning before we begin: the images that follow directly contend with America's history of slavery and lynching. Gonzalez-Day photographs historical objects, be they from archives or museums, and suggests new meanings for them by thoughtfully altering their composition or display. Excuse me. Here we have two works from his Erased Lynching series. This series, Gonzalez-Day tells us, was sparked in response to anti-immigration rhetoric that directly led to an increase in vigilante activity along the US-Mexican border in the early 2000s. Each image is a recasting of a lynching photograph that took place in the United States between 1850 and 1942, where Gonzalez-Day rephotographs the image and removes the victim and the hanging materials from the composition. Gonzalez-Day has researched and uncovered 350 cases of lynching in the state of California alone, as detailed in his book, Lynching in the West, 1850 to 1935. As Taina Carrigal states in Unseen's catalog, rather than inflicting more violence upon the victims, Gonzalez-Day directs our attention to perpetrators and bystanders to consider mob violence nationwide, exposing the vulnerability of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Jews, and immigrant communities. Their absent bodies stand for their untold histories against the myth of a white Anglo-American identity. Titus Kaphar paints in the tradition of Euro-American colonial portraiture, but then adds a contemporary layer that is often physical, such as cutting, shrouding, or smearing the canvas. Before us, we have a well-known portrait of Thomas Jefferson shrouding or revealing the portrait of an enslaved Black woman. In Kaphar's words, this portrait is at once about Sallie Mae Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, as well as the many women whose liberty was taken from them and whose tragic relationships have been shrouded by historically inaccurate narratives of deified men in positions of power. The process of hiding the known and revealing the unknown, according to co-curator Asma Naim, makes us realize that history is complex, it's messy, and filled with many different perspectives, and that ultimately, our understanding of the past is more complete when more of our stories can be told. Both Gonzalez-Day and Kaphar use public domain works to probe foundational myths in order to reclaim a space for those left unseen. I would encourage you to seek out both their works, not only as an illustration of the power of using the public domain, but also to challenge how each of us sees and understands our place in the United States. Now, we are essentially out of time for today, but I would like to invite anyone who wishes to stay after for an informal Q&A with our presenters. And thank you. We will have Katie Rowland bring us home.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining our celebration of the life cycle of copyright. As Whitney said, we're going to conclude our program now, thanking all of our panelists. If anyone would like to join me in thanking them for their participation. Thank you all, and we're so happy you could enjoy our celebration of the life cycle of copyright with us. Until our next event on April 25th, which is about the World IP Day, about going for the gold in sports. We'll see you then. Thank you.